Well, should we get started? Welcome. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. My name is Josh Silberg. I'll be moderating today's discussion about Hakai Magazine's editorial package called Big Fish, the Aquacultural Revolution. The basis of this is as the world's population is expanding to 9.7 billion people, aquaculture is going to be playing a key role. And if that's true, what can we learn? How can we avoid mistakes? And how do we move forward? It is not about debating the merits or pitfalls of aquaculture. It's more about pushing this narrative forward and kind of raising awareness and having a discussion. So in this webinar, we are joined by 5 wonderful journalists. Jude Isabella from Victoria. Jude, give a wave. There. So Jude is about 100 meters behind me in Victoria. Brendan Burrell in Los Angeles. And Brian Payton, who is about 3 hours north of us in Comox. Paul Tullis, who's actually in Amsterdam, across the pond. And Jess Mackey, who is elsewhere in Victoria, British Columbia. So the way today is going to work is we're going to ask each one of the journalists to go through a little bit about behind the scenes of how they, came into this story, what they learned from it, etc. Then we're going to have a bit of a general discussion with all of them, and then at the end, around 12:15, we'll have a time for audience questions. So if you have a question, the chat has been disabled, but there's a Q&A button you'll see at the bottom, so you can type it in there. We have an editor standing by who's going to pass along the questions. So at the end, around 12:15, we'll get to some audience questions. At around 12:30 is when we're officially done. So an hour, whatever time it is, but an hour from now. But the journalists have said they'll stick around. If there's still questions and a good discussion, we can extend it. Great. So starting off, we have Jude Isabella, who's the editor-in-chief of Hakai Magazine. She's also authored a book called Salmon, a scientific memoir. She conceived of the package. She wrote the introduction. And we are just going to start off by asking, how would you respond to people who might be surprised that Hakai Magazine would cover aquaculture? And how did this kind of editorial package come to be?
Josh, for the people who were actually, honestly, on some of the comments we've had are somewhat disappointed, I would say that we wanted to get beyond that conversation about farm salmon and farm shrimp, because in the global north, that's what dominates our conversation about aquaculture. I'm not sure how healthy that is and how, as you said, how much that moves the conversation forward. So when we were thinking, we wanted to do an editorial package this year, and we sat around thinking about aquaculture. So many of our pitches, again, are about farmed Atlantic salmon and about farm shrimp, and we've done our share of very scathing critiques. And then our editor of news, Colin Schultz, said, I always see this thing about FAO saying we got to feed 9.7 billion people. And if we're going to do that, we have to rely on fish, and aquaculture is going to take up a lot of the slack that wild caught fisheries can't produce. Or, we've overharvested. We all know what's wrong with wild caught fisheries. So that was a good frame. So I went to the Boston Seafood Expo, or the North American Seafood Expo in Boston. It's huge, it's enormous. There's people there from all over the world. And I went to all these sessions that were about aquaculture. And I think I knew it was a big business. And I think I knew there was a lot of investment in it and there's a lot of research, but I knew it kind of theoretically. And then it was just, wow, it was exactly as Colin had framed it, was, hey, FAO, we're going to feed this. How are we going to do this? How are we going to move forward with aquaculture? But I didn't really think the conversation talked very much about how we're actually domesticating an entire system, right? We're an aquatic species. So I wanted to talk about that without a polarized debate, really polarized debate, but kind of give readers an idea of what's going on out there and how we can move. Sorry, go ahead.
I think there's parallels with agriculture, have these discussions happened in the agricultural world?
Yeah, I was just going to say that is that, when we domesticated wheat and other grains over 10,000 years ago, and then sheep and goats, it took thousands of years to get where we are today. And we're accelerating that with aquaculture, and partly because of the technology we have available to us. And there are researchers who are looking at levels of domestication of fish, and they actually put Atlantic salmon up there quite high, and stuff like carp being very much a 5 out of a scale of 5 of domestication.
And so were you surprised by the kind of reaction in some ways, or was it kind of expected in some ways?
It was expected because I think people approach the aquaculture, especially in the global north, with a certain lens. And it's very difficult to think that salmon and shrimp are only a very slender part of the aquaculture story. And we have a chance in a way to kind of think, to take our gaze a little bit away from that, think about other aquaculture endeavors and how we might be able to steer them to a more equitable enterprise, where we focus on medium, small scale, and stuff like bivalves that are really a good thing to invest in sustainably for sustainable food and for equitable food.
Great. That gets us rolling, gets a discussion rolling. For those of you just joining, there's a Q&A button at the bottom, and at the end, we'll be able to answer some of your questions if you have them. So you can ask questions there. And for now, we'll keep things between the panelists. So moving on to the next piece, which was by Brendan Burrell. It was called Show Me the Money Fish. And I'll just read a small bit that kind of encapsulates what his piece was about. But guilt is among the least persuasive forces in the market. What is desire? That's why all pieces of offshore aquaculture pipe dream, the sustainability, the sustenance, and the profits depend not only on good intentions, but also on finding the right fish to make it a reality. So I understand that your primary contact was a little bit hesitant to talk to you for this piece on offshore aquaculture. Can you tell me a bit about that, Brendan?
Wow, we're jumping right into that. I mean, yeah. So this piece was about kind of thinking about what's going to be the next big fish, right? This whole thing that Jude's talking about, it's eating down the food chain, and it's like eating sardines, anchovies, and I like a sardine, every once in a while on toast. But what we really want is like the tuna and the salmon and something like that that's delicious. And so there's this guy, Neil Sims, who I was going out to meet in Hawaii, or hoping to. And he's kind of a pioneer in this effort. And I reached out to him, and there was definitely some hesitation, like, I don't know if I want to be talking to this environmentalist magazine, Hakai, et cetera, because he had been burned before. There are all these negative connotations about aquaculture. Neil had been on a panel before with folks from, I think, Food and Water Watch, where they basically just gave him a hard time about what he was doing. But this guy, I mean, he believed in it. He believed that the problems that we're facing today, the things we've seen, like Jude says, in salmon and shrimp, could be, we could get past those. And that was kind of his goal. Yeah.
Is he just working on these luxury fishes, or is he looking at kind of a wide variety of things?
Well, I mean, he began, casting a wide net. He started out about 20 years ago, landed in Hawaii with just the idea of, all right, what's going to be the thing, a marine fish that we can domesticate? I mean, one of the challenges is the salmon, we think it's the main thing you farm, but they have these really big eggs, whereas most marine fish, they're tiny, tiny little, like sesame, poppy seed sized eggs. And getting these things to, like, keeping them alive in the first days is this huge challenge. So we started with like 10 fish and started figuring out what's going to be one that can work. And he eventually singled it down to something he calls kona kampachi, which you can actually eat like sashimi. Yeah.
That's really cool. We will come back to that idea of offshore and branding, and what to call fish in a bit. Moving to Brian Payton's piece was, so sorry, I should have introduced these people as well. Brandon is a contributing writer for Hakai Magazine, and he's taking the time nicely out of his busy schedule, where he is writing a book on the coronavirus, a very topical issue. So moving to Brian, Brian's also a contributing writer to Hakai Magazine, and he's written books called Shadow of the Bear, The Ice Passage, and a novel called The Wind is Not a River. And Brian's piece was called Taking the Fish Out of Fish Feed. And the little piece that I thought encapsulated his piece was consider the vegan diet. If people are used to eating steak, they're not going to find a single plant to replace the steak's nutritional makeup. For proper nutritional balance, they have to consume a variety of things. Farm fish don't require fish meal or fish oil. They require nutrients those ingredients happen to contain. So Paul's piece is about these black soldier flies. And you visited this Intera factory in the lower mainland of near Vancouver. Can you tell us a little bit about what that factory looked like? Did it look like a normal farm? What
it was a large greenhouse facility, and you approach this place thinking, they're likely growing tomatoes or cucumbers or something in there. It has that look about it, and I suppose at one point it was used for that. But then you go inside, and as soon as you pass through the various curtains to get you in, you see all kinds of trays, some moving on conveyor belts, some stacked vertically, filled with wriggling maggots. And in the air are black soldier fly adults, and they're about an inch long. They're more slender than a deer fly or horse fly, not as fat, but they have sort of wasp-like antennas, and they buzz around. So it's a little intimidating. And the ones that are flying around are escapees from the mating pens. So it's a little, it's unusual to say the least to be in there, but the smell was interesting. It doesn't smell like rotting food, which is essentially what they eat. It just had a very earthy smell. It smelled like you've just turned over the spade in your garden or something. So it was a really sort of interesting smell I found there. And once I got past the fact that these things are flying around my face, and I realized they can't sting you, they can't bite you, I sort of calmed down and got into it.
And what's the big push for black soldier fly? What is it about them that makes them potentially really great for aquaculture?
Well, yeah. So what attracted me to the potential of the story was, I wasn't aware that so much wildlife is still being consumed by the aquaculture industry. I knew that they were working on the problem, and I kind of in my mind thought, well, they've pretty much solved it. Well, the fact is they've just reached a certain level and stayed there as the aquaculture industry grows, and there's a gap opening up. So the wild forage fish that goes into the fish meal, which feeds the salmon and the other species, is somewhat necessary if you look.
Oh, did we lose Brian there? We might have lost him. Well, this happens in these sorts of things. So we will improvise. I think what he was going to say was that black soldier fly gets fed to these fish. We will try to work to get Brian back. It's used as one of these potential fish feeds moving forward that can take wild fish and into fish meal out of it. We will work to get Brian back, but as we do that, we will move on to Paul Tullis. Paul is an experienced writer from the US who now lives in Amsterdam. This is his first time contributing to Hakai Magazine. And his piece also included some reporting in Myanmar from Hatu Tezar. Paul's article was called Hold the Salt, the Promise of Fresh Little Fishes. And the little sentence that I pulled out of his was that the fish ponds of smallholders are not supplying the luxury fish sold in upscale North American and European markets. They're feeding their neighbors. So the question we had for Paul was, what do you think the takeaway from your piece is from the global north? And what can we learn from these freshwater ponds in Southeast Asia that we might be able to think about elsewhere?
Thanks, Josh, and I hope we can get Brian back because I don't have as much material to cover half of his time. But I would say two things mainly. One is that aquaculture in most of the world does not mean what it means to us, which is chiefly salmon and shrimp, as Jude touched upon in the intro. Those two species are actually only 10% of global aquaculture production, yet because they are what's in the grocery stores where North Americans and Europeans shop, there's a tendency among us to equate aquaculture with those two species. And that's really only true for a small fraction of the world's population. Second is that because aquaculture is so much more than salmon and shrimp, the environmental problems associated with those two species, destruction of carbon sequestering mangroves and habitat, escaped fish, pollution, disease spreading to local natives, and so on, they're not necessarily problems associated with aquaculture as it's practiced in Southeast Asia, where the reporting from this story came from, and which is one of the leading regions in the globe for aquaculture production. Much of this is medium scale farms of 5 to 20 acres, about the size of a typical city block, on land that was already farmland. So no destruction of rainforest or habitat involved, and is enclosed from natural waterways, and in many cases doesn't even use fish feed. I wasn't able to go to Myanmar to report because of the coronavirus, but I did hire an excellent reporter and photographer there named Jude Isabella. And what I heard from him and from people, academics, social scientists who have traveled extensively in that area studying aquaculture, is that fish farmers will also often raise poultry, and they build their poultry pens over the ponds so the waste goes into the pond and feeds the fish. And the feed that they get every day consists of what would otherwise, what the fish are getting, that is, what would otherwise be waste from production of food for humans, byproducts from rice milling or peanut oil, brewery waste, virtually any kind of food waste will go into these ponds. So these operations are in many cases amortizing the carbon footprint of other food production. I wonder whether the methods that are growing so quickly in Southeast Asia and providing so much cheap, relatively sustainable protein for local populations, whether these methods can be spread to the global north. Rice paddies are often converted in Myanmar to aquaculture production. And there's some rice grown in the US, of course. Now, much of that is in California, and given the climate in the Central Valley, I'm not sure I would advocate for large ponds of water, evaporating in the desert heat when environmental uses need it also in cities. But there are other places where farmers are struggling in the US, and whether these farmers can be farmed in other climates, or maybe the global north climates are okay for some of these species. And maybe some of the species there can be marketed here, which is something I think Jess got into in her story.
Yeah, where are most of these freshwater fish? Where are they actually consumed from Myanmar?
There, most of their production in Bangladesh and Myanmar is consumed by the people living around the aquaculture production areas. Our reporter went to the big fish market in Yangon, the former capital of Myanmar and its financial center and biggest city. And there's a huge market there, and people are moving tens of thousands of kilograms a day of farmed fish through there. And only a small portion of it is going to export. According to research that's been done, most of it is feeding the growing population there, which is just, what this package was addressing is, how do we sustainably feed a growing population, and a population that's growing wealthier? People, as they get wealthier, they demand more protein in their diets. And if that protein, it's got to come from somewhere. And so what are the most sustainable places for that to come from? It can be plant protein if there's no land use change or indirect land use change, but it can also be aquaculture. So those populations, in several of the poorest countries in the world, those populations would be eating a lot less protein and getting less of the nutrients involved from fish if it weren't for aquaculture production locally.
Great. That's awesome. So we'll get back more if people have questions about food production in Southeast Asia, et cetera, too. We can absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, it's not without environmental costs, just like anything, and intensification is an issue of concern. So, I don't want to paint too rosy a picture, but these entrepreneurs in Southeast Asia are showing that the potential is there to do it with minimal environmental impact, and that's what the research is showing.
Great. Just a reminder for people, if you're just joining us or what have you, you can hit the Q&A button at the bottom. The chat's been disabled, but if you want to ask questions that we'll get to potentially as many as we can at the end, go on the Q&A. You can put in your name, affiliation if you'd like, and then we'll get to as many as we can towards the end. So moving on, our final journalist on the panel is Jess Mackey. Jess, this was her first story as a fellow for Hakai Magazine, and she's since joined as an associate editor. Her piece was called How to Stop Worrying and Loved Farmed Fish. And the piece that I thought was really interesting was actually the very last few lines, which is, I have no idea whether these oysters are wild or farmed. I wonder if that distinction matters, or if it's one more thing to divide and distract us from what really does, to do our best to eat with care. So the question for Jess we had is, what is it like to be at a swanky culinary event in New York and watching celebrity chefs kind of promote farmed fish? Was there a kind of disconnect between that lavishness and feeding the world, like what Paul was just talking about?
Yeah, I mean, it was a little bit swanky. I mean, it was definitely like a white tablecloth affair, right? Mm-hmm. And I love food, and I love food culture, food history, and I was at the James Beard House, which is in Greenwich Village in New York, and it is very much the center of the culinary world in the States. You could even say that to some extent in Canada. Like, the chefs love to be there. It's now the location of the James Beard Foundation, which doles out essentially the Oscars of the culinary world. Like, it's a very well-respected place, and you very much feel that reverence and the adoration and just all that history that's there. So that was really cool. As far as the disconnect, I would say yes and no. I mean, so the dinner itself was an 8-course meal, and every single dish contained fish. I mean, that's a crap ton of fish, right? And what I was privy to in the kitchen, which the other guests weren't, was that the chefs are not advocating that you eat fish at every single meal, right? They're saying you should be eating a plant-based diet. And I think we've all kind of touched on that in our stories, how we should be eating lower in the food chain, mostly bivalves and plants, right? And so that's what they're saying behind the scenes. And if you must seek out protein, which we all must do if we're not vegans, then we ought to reach for fish, and we ought to reach for the most sustainable options. And and so the lavishness, I would say, eating fish is a far better choice than eating beef or pork or chicken, right? I think we can all agree on that.
So it was a relative environmental impact that was most interesting. And did they, when you talk about like the reverence at which, what sorts of things did they look at when they were, did they talk about when they were describing where the fish came from? Like, did they know everything about it, or were they kind of just about the fish species itself?
Yeah, I mean, many of the chefs had even been to these farms, right? Because they want to see these practices themselves, because they know what the reputation is. They know that a lot of people think this is a very dirty industry. And so they want to go to these farms and ask a bunch of questions to the farmers and the people running the operations, and make sure that they can vouch for that product and that they can then give it to their customers. They don't want to be giving out the bad stuff. Right.
That's very interesting. Cool. So now we'll move to where anybody can answer or ask each other questions. So I guess the first for any of you is there anything that kind of surprised you during your reporting, or if there's elements that kind of changed your view of aquaculture as you went?
I can answer this from being at that expo. Was just so eye-opening for me, is how at the expo we had on the floor where everybody's hawking their wares and everything, you had competing messages. Always fresh, never frozen. Always wild, right? You had the whole Alaska thing, Oregon, all that kind of stuff. But then you had this equal message about sustainable aquaculture, There was actually some areas I couldn't go into, especially when I told them I was a journalist. That was an aquaculture product, and they just didn't, and they made sure, you know, their whole shtick there, and I couldn't ascertain whether it was true or not, was that it was sustainable, that they were doing this in a responsible manner or whatever. But there's a couple of little exhibits that kind of wouldn't let me in, which I thought was kind of interesting. Yeah, I was amazed. Side by side, it's a very robust industry. And I'll tell you this one story, which I just really kind of thought was fascinating. I met this guy from Spain. His family had been in wholesale fish business since the 1950s. And then there he was selling frozen fish entrees. That was his thing for the Expo. And I just had a conversation with him, and he said that his family actually switched from wholesale fish to these frozen entrees like in 2012 or something. They saw this sea change of what consumers wanted, and not only and they wanted packaged food, and they wanted to eat fish. And 80% of the fish in his product were from aquaculture, and it was because because of size consistency, right? That you don't get with wild caught, and which has other problems when people are looking for size consistency. It actually has a problem for wild caught. But in any case, I thought that was just like, wow, combining two things, convenience and I want fish, right? And here was a family that totally changed their business model, totally changed it. So that was something that I was just like, wow, we've got to do something on aquaculture.
And not necessarily something that you would see or talk to people in this, certainly in this part of the world. Anybody else had something that surprised them or kind of changed their view or shifted a paradigm?
The other thing I'll say is, can I just add something about pouch tuna?
Yeah, you're the editor-in-chief. You can do whatever you want.
That was the first time I saw pouch tuna. Tuna not in cans, tuna in pouches that were all flavored, right? So you would eat, I know, it's kind of like you go hiking and you have those pouches of food that you add water to. Here was, you could just eat this tuna, again, convenience, and it wasn't farm tuna, but it was in a pouch and all, ready to eat. So that was the other thing too, that kind of was this convenience.
Sounds like the exact opposite of what Jess went through at the Beard House.
Yeah, and these are the people these are consumers. There's not one consumer. There's multiple consumers, and they want different things. Right.
Yo, Brendan, you were gonna say something?
Oh, because I unmuted. No. I guess I'm still sort of stuck on this idea about aquaculture being controversial. And I think one of the things that I was thinking about and thinking about the guy that I met, Neil Sims, is he's just such a pragmatist. And one of the things that you would hear from the environmental side is like, we should be moving all this stuff and be putting it on land. We should have these things on tanks in Iowa so that they're away from the ocean, and that's going to be the safest way to do things. And, and then when I was sort of doing my reporting, I started kind of hearing that, people have tried this. And when you do that, suddenly your fish are on life support. Everybody knows how hard it is to keep up an aquarium and that whole process. And if you look at kind of the history of land-based aquaculture, it has failed again and again. It's like you have a power outage, you lose all your fish, you have all kinds of things going on. And then of course, the greenhouse gases of, the pumps and the tanks and everything. And so sort of knowing we've had, that this stuff's been sort of unfolding over 10 years. And here, Neil Sims is today sort of still pounding the drum like we need to be moving offshore. And I was actually kind of surprised that there still is so much resistance. This guy's getting sued again and again. He's trying to run a test operation out in the Gulf of Mexico. And these organizations are trying to stop them any way they can. And I'm actually still surprised because I'm kind of, I think, coming out of this reporting project, I've always, I'm skeptical of, say, shrimp farming. That seems terrible to me. but coming out of this, I am really starting to kind of be excited about what the next step's going to be, and to see some of these commercial products come out that are going to feel good to actually buy, you know?
Yeah,
So
fewer blanket statements and more kind of nuance.
Yeah.
I guess another question, is there any sort of great stories or threads that you kind of wanted to put in these stories but didn't quite make it in? Or there's all sorts of things on the cutting room floor, stuff that might spark future kind of stories down the line?
Taste.
Taste. Okay,
Yeah,
what about taste?
I would have loved to have included taste in this. For the most part, scientists have shown that most of us learn to like something or love something. And I think like salmon is this is when Atlantic farm salmon is actually a good example of how we, like, take the Norwegian population. They were used to wild Atlantic salmon up until like the 1980s or so. And now you just eat pretty much farmed Atlantic salmon in Norway, and you get used to that taste. It's a different taste than a wild caught salmon that you throw on the barbecue or whatever. So when aquaculturists all say, hey, polls say people prefer farmed, they prefer it because they've learned to prefer that, right? So then when we talk about, I don't like bivalves, or I don't like freshwater fish, I don't like whatever, I think we have to see it more holistically, that if you want people to eat more fish, and actually FAO has done a really good job of convincing people to do that, is that you have to start young, and you have to start them on, parents start them on stuff that's sustainable and equitable to eat,
So we might have to diversify some palettes. Yeah. Anybody else have anything that they were kind of threads that they wanted to pull but didn't quite make it in, or future reporting?
Well, I guess to touch on Jude's point, one of the things I learned is a lot of these fish that maybe aren't great when they're wild caught, you bring them into a farm and you feed them on a farm where they're not doing as much, and you're giving them a high fat diet, they actually get tastier. And so I think there are potentially other fish in the ocean that could be real winners in the future.
Oh, it looks like Brian's back. That might be really good timing, because we were just talking about the taste of fish, and if you feed them something, how it tastes different. I hear you ate a black soldier fly larva. What did that taste like?
I did. It was somewhat like roasted peanuts with a little sunflower seeds thrown in on the top. It was not that bad. You just have to get past the look of it.
Right. So maybe that was one of the interesting pieces that I found throughout Brendan and Brian's, what you feed these fish, just because it's considered a trash fish from wild caught, or it's full of parasites outside. If you farm it correctly, it can actually be an improved product. Okay. Let's see what, we haven't really touched on bivalves as much. And that's one of the things that it's been mentioned a few times. So bivalves being kind of mussels, oysters, shellfish. Does anyone want to comment on bivalves and maybe how that fits into the aquaculture picture? Sure, Brian.
First of all, apologies. The power outage, I think, has to do with these people building a house across the street. I will get them. Bivalves, yes. From my research, what I found interesting was that when they look at aquaculture as a whole, when they look at the trends of aquaculture, and when the FAO comments on the direction aquaculture should be going, they all talk about eating down the food chain. Now, of course, there's the explosion of finfish, which, if you look at that data, is going in the wrong direction. They think if we're going to be using aquaculture in a way that does not repeat the mistakes made with other animal agriculture, we need to be farming seaweed, algae, and if not just those, then animals that are as far down the food chain and as close to plants as possible. And that leaves us with bivalves. We're talking about mussels, oysters, those kinds of things. And so I found that an interesting sort of in run around what I was writing about. I'm writing about how you feed fish. And what the FAO is saying, what all of the science is pointing us toward, is eating further down the food chain. And most of those bivalves don't require us to feed them.
Right. And Jess, you went out with an oyster farmer on the East Coast. How was that experience?
Yeah, I mean, it was great. And, there really is this renaissance in their oysters, right? People are appreciating aquaculture when it comes to bivalves, at least in the Chesapeake, because they know that the wild oysters have basically been decimated, right, from disease and overfishing. But I think one of the issues is that so many of these oysters are going to raw bars, like really fancy places where you have a nice night out and you have your wine and your beer, whatever. And a lot of people maybe don't know how to cook oysters, mussels, clams at home. I mean, Jude and I talked about this a little bit, but a lot of Americans, and certainly a lot of Canadians, they don't really cook seafood at home all that much. They're a little bit squeamish about it. Oh, it's gonna smell up the house. So I feel like that kind of, hinders the market in a way.
Right. So it's not just access to, but it's education about how to. I know I'm cooking a new thing, especially something if you cook improperly can have health ramifications that can be a little intimidating for people.
Mm-hmm.
So we have a couple minutes left and then we'll go to audience questions. So there's a Q&A button at the bottom if you'd like to ask a question. We will get to as many as we can. We talked a little bit about the global north having a narrow view. Other than bivalves, do you think there are other species like catfish or otherwise that are a bit lower in the food chain is it a marketing problem? Is it a technology problem of how to farm them, or why do we only really see these couple species in our grocery stores?
Oh, that's a good question, Josh. I'm not really sure. One of the things that I came across, and we didn't cover it all, was catfish farming. And there's actually a lot of catfish farming in the US, and they provide for the domestic market, which is interesting. I don't think I've ever seen a catfish in the grocery store. Maybe I just haven't looked. I certainly haven't seen it on the menu here. But, I mean, we're in the Pacific Northwest, so you're going to see other things. But even when I've been back east, I don't think I've really seen catfish. And from what I understand, there's some operations that are really sustainably good, right? It's not a terribly expensive fish. And as Brendan was saying, what you feed them, that influences the taste of that fish. So yeah, I think maybe it is a marketing problem, which is why we sent Jess to do that marketing story. It's an uphill battle. Yeah, I think, again, we get squeamish about cooking these things. Like, oh, can I cook oysters myself? Honestly, I have oysters mostly in a restaurant. And I thought, after this package, what am I doing? And I just walked an 8-minute walk down to my grocery store. I got local oysters that came from Souk, which is less than an hour away from Victoria. I brought them back and we put them on the barbecue, and it was delicious. And I'm like, why don't I do this more often? I'm not sure. And I like oysters. I know how to cook seafood. And yet, I don't know, maybe I'm a little lazy. I'm not sure.
Still intimidating at first.
Yeah.
Just one final question we'll get to before we get to audience questions. It came up a bunch in Paul's piece was, we're talking about small and mid-sized people. Is there a worry about industrialization of aquaculture and how that might parallel with what has happened in agriculture or what's already happened?
Yeah, it is a concern. Some big companies from China, which is the world's leader in aquaculture production, are coming in and buying up land in Myanmar to make these big operations. And of course, that's demand driven. They think there's a market for that. And my story talked about the feasibility of increasing aquaculture production as a means of sustainably providing protein for a growing wealthier population. The more intensive operations can be less environmentally friendly, but intensification can also be done sustainably, according to Professor Simon Bush, who I interviewed. He's the chair of the environmental policy group at Wageningen University and a member of the technical advisory board for Monterey Bay Aquarium Seafood Watch. So yeah, it's something to be concerned about, making sure those operations are stood up in a way that is as least damaging as possible. but we don't necessarily need to equate intensification with environmental damage.
Got it. So
I'd like to know from Jess, actually, on the subject of species and marketing, you know, what were the species being fed to you at this James Beard Foundation? Was it a lot of catfish and tilapia and carp, or is it, you know, higher end stuff?
Yeah, it's the sexy stuff, right? It's the bigger kind of almost sport fish. I mean, you have salmon, and then you have this fish that was called sablefish, which is grown at the tip of Vancouver Island, and it's very buttery, right? It's got a very sweet flavor, which I don't think you necessarily think of when you think of like catfish or carp. So I think it's all that those narratives and those preconceived notions that are already established, right, that keep people from maybe eating these freshwater species.
Great. So we will get through, thank you for those discussions. We are going to answer some questions from the audience. So we will get through as many as we can in the next kind of 15 or 20 minutes. And then if there's still questions and people are willing to stick around, they can, but I'll stop the kind of general portion at that. So first question is from Julie Clausen. One of the big ecological issues is the use of non-native species. Tilapia, for example, has been introduced around the world for aquaculture, but there's escapees. So how do we balance the need for fish as food versus protecting biodiversity, and who should be making these cost-benefit decisions?
Well, I can just say one thing from my reporting that I found pretty interesting. I mean, yeah, one of the criticisms, especially with salmon, is all right. We've taken this species and kind of domesticated it to some degree, and it's in places where it didn't live before. And one of the things that's neat about, say, Neil Sims using a marine fish, for instance, rather than one of the things about salmon is they return to their natal streams. They have lots of different subspecies, or however you want to categorize them. But marine fish are very broadly distributed. They get all around they'll cover an entire ocean. So there's a lot more genetic mixing. And so kind of the beauty of using one of those fish in an open ocean ecosystem is you don't have as much concern about escapees, especially if you try to use the wild fish. You don't sort of selectively breed it in any way. And so I think that's one interesting strategy to do that. Maybe there's something different people could speak of with the inland or the catfish and so on. I don't know. Yeah.
And who should be? That was another interesting point of the question. Who makes these decisions about fish farming? And you were mentioning, Brendan, about Gulf of Mexico and Gulf of California, that Neil Sims getting in legal trouble there.
Yeah, I mean, with his particular battle, that question is still up in the air, at least. So in the US, we've got multiple agencies that potentially can regulate aquaculture in the ocean. You have the Environmental Protection Agency, you have our Fisheries Agency, NOAA, and then you have like the state authorities and so on. And it's a little bit like nobody really, it's not exactly clear at least in the US, who's making these choices. So they'll look at how much waste is coming out of the waste pens, not necessarily what fish you're using, whereas another agency might actually look at, say, the risk of escapees. But I actually don't know enough to know what sort of global agreements there are with respect to moving fish around, but maybe somebody else knows. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I don't know that I'm equipped to answer that either. I think it's such a good question. I think that's kind of the point of the package is here we are domesticating aquatic species rapidly. And is there any coordinated effort aside from the FAO to have some kind of plan in place? The plans seem more ad hoc, country by country.
Right. Okay, moving on.
Jump in there 1 second.
Oh yeah, go ahead.
Now, from my reporting, it seems like the answer is it's market driven. Where can the profit be made? And of course, this is an industry, and an industry exists to make a profit. And so that's what's driving this. And so people in North America want salmon and shrimp. So it comes down to preference. It comes down to customers deciding that that's what they want, or they may shift. In the case of shrimp, shrimp wasn't even on the U.S. diet before the Second World War, really. It became popularized in the 1950s with shrimp cocktail, and then suddenly it's one of the most famous and most sought after seafood products we have. So, tastes change, right? Cultures around fish change. And so it's about what it is we as consumers want to have. And so that'll make its way up to the preferences they make for the fish that they're going after.
Interesting. Great. Thank you. Next question is from Kinley Gillette. Can you elaborate on why some readers, as we mentioned earlier, were disappointed in the project? Do you think people object to any positive portrayal of aquaculture, or that discussing it is irrelevant or unimportant? Or is it just because they're focusing on these kind of specific species that maybe have a bad reputation?
Why are people disappointed? Is that
Yeah.
kind of encapsulates the question? I think it's, like I said, the lens that there can be no positive discussion about aquaculture without somehow diluting the message that we're not doing aquaculture right? So I think that's what it is. Whereas I would like, and I think at the magazine we like to do this, we like to think, let's move this conversation forward. Let's think about something positive, because we are not going to go back to a world in the foreseeable future unless we totally change how we manage wild caught fisheries, where we're only eating wild caught fish, meaning bivalves, fin fish, everything that the FAO defines as fish. So I think it's just lens, very difficult to maybe open that lens a little bit further.
Right. We have a question that's kind of been asked by two different people, Richard Volk and Thomas Mackey, who might have a relation to Jess Mackey, I'm not sure. And it's about questions about certification programs. So the MSC, Marine Stewardship Council, the Monterey Bay, Oceanwise, there's these various kind of sustainability programs that all work in kind of different ways. And can any of you discuss kind of what the pros and cons and maybe ways forward are with that?
Well, one thing that's a little bit confusing and that I didn't know going in is that there's a difference between programs that rate seafood and programs that certify it. So like the ASC certifies seafood, and Oceanwise or the Monterey Bay program rates it, right? Based on basically like a street light system, green light, yellow light, red light. And so that's really confusing, right? And people kind of conflate them. And so I talked about this a bit in my piece. That's one of the things that makes it so difficult to understand, like what is what and what is sustainable, what is better than something else. So just navigating that can be so hard for consumer. And that's why oftentimes they're just gonna say to hell with it and go and buy a piece of chicken or beef, right? Yeah.
And you know what, Josh, that's the big difference. And it was Fiona Lewis who I met at the Expo, who's in Jess's piece. She goes, people talk about fish, and there are just so many different species of fish. Whereas if you look at terrestrial livestock, it's beef, chicken, pork. That's it. So, and we know how it's raised, ethically or unethically, organic or non-organic. But when it comes to fish, you have so many choices. I mean, it is wide open. It is much more difficult to make those decisions in a way because you have so many species to choose from. So that's also, I think, part of the problem.
Interesting. So it's actually, I mean, these certification programs have a big challenge to actually convey simply to consumers what is sustainable, in whatever way they value that.
Mm-hmm.
Question from Casey Rents. This is for Brendan, but anyone can answer. Talking about having a potentially reluctant source for your piece, and does that influence the angle that you pursue? And Jude also mentioned like areas of the expo that she was that was kind of the back room that was hidden. So yeah, how does the way aquaculture is portrayed, or what rooms you get into, who you get to talk to, kind of affect your reporting?
Can I break in just for just a second? Hi, Casey. Casey is the one who introduced me to Neil Sims. She had met him prior and had told me about him, which I thought was really lovely of her. And I interviewed him at the Seafood Expo prior to Brendan. So thanks, Casey, and thanks for tuning in.
Yeah, so I guess Brendan or others, who will talk to you and what they will say kind of affect your ability as journalists to cover this topic?
Well, I guess I'll talk. Yeah, so I mean, Sims was interesting because he had some reluctance and some resistance, but he was also, as my editor called him, a quote machine, because he just was so compelled to talk. That once we sort of started chatting for a while, he was more agreeable to sort of giving me an inside view. But certainly, yeah, I mean, who agrees to talk or doesn't agree to talk can shape the piece. Sometimes you decide this person's not talking to me, but they are the person I'm going to write about, and I don't care. And other times, you just end up finding an alternative route. And I did talk to there are other sort of pioneers in the industry, who were working on Barramundi or Cobia in Panama. But it was kind of like, once I started talking to Sims, I went in that direction and found him very compelling. So it was just the way it turned out. Yeah.
I initially really wanted to get like an inside look at these marketing rooms and these people in an advertisement world. Mm-hmm. And it was so hard. I would be talking to people that are essentially working in PR, and the conversation would be going well. And then once they started to actually get at questions around, okay, how are you trying to change the narrative? Like, what are you actually doing? The conversation would shut down. They would say it's proprietary knowledge, and that would be it.
Okay, so it's hard to actually get there. There's only a certain place that you can get, and they want to control that. Yeah, mm-hmm. Brian, you have?
I had the same response about the black soldier fly larva. I would ask pointed questions about the trays that they were on, the food that they were given, how they were, how they were cooked in the end. And time and again, they would say, we can't tell you, or please don't photograph that, or please don't talk about that, because it's proprietary knowledge in this super competitive industry, in the race to get black soldier fly larvae products, the protein and the oil, to the market first. And I was really surprised by that. So, but yeah, they're inventing this domestication of, as Jude says, the entire food chain. And so it's a scramble, and I think it's a really important time to look at what's going on and to ask ourselves, in this case, these are more dependents we're going to have in our society. So what more dependence do we want to bring into the food system? So when I was working on the story, I was working on another story concurrently about an end run around all of this, and it goes to, I sent myself down to California, UC Berkeley, to the alt meat lab, where they're studying how to make not just the next Beyond Meat burger or the next Impossible burger, but alt fish and other alt meat products. They're also looking at finding out how to replicate the actual taste of cow milk. And so it became a really interesting journey for me to look at ways of rethinking the food system, because this is an opportunity we have here as people scramble to ramp up aquaculture. We have this opportunity. It's so much harder when animal agriculture is ramped up to the level it is today to take parts of it away. But when you're building it, you can build it better if you think about it.
Yeah, insects are really interesting and a big part of that, I think. Just getting to one or two last questions before we hit the 12:30 mark. Carolyn Sablefish, apologies if I got that name wrong, is asking about biggest data and information gaps for industry and political leaders to make smart decisions. Was there any that you came across? Is part of the information gap a proprietary kind of hidden decision, or are there just a lot of things that we need to study more intensively?
In Southeast Asia, they just don't know how extensive this aquaculture really is. And one thing that they're going to do next, actually, I was hoping to tag along on this research expedition that some researchers from Michigan State University and World Fish, an organization based in Malaysia, were going to do the part I was going to be on was they were going to, go around and talk to farmers and stuff. But what they're also doing is they're examining satellite data, satellite images, and they're using machine learning to train convolutional neural networks on what an aquaculture, a fish pond looks like from thousands, millions of examples. And then they find those in satellite imagery, which is, relatively cheap to obtain now. So what they're hoping to do is get an answer as to, how much acreage is necessary to produce how much food. And that's obviously going to be a big question that we're going to need to answer if we're talking about feeding a population growing as big as it's projected to grow.
Right. And what about traceability? So, I mean, you're talking about this goes to this farm and in through the kind of markets in Myanmar, what are some of the things that you were thinking of or things that you've heard around how to better trace kind of fish from farm to table, literally?
Well, there are technologies being developed that I've worked on. I've looked at on other stories actually that are not fish specific. One is using DNA analysis of the microbiome of an environment. Right now, they're using it for to detect sweatshop labor. So each place in the world has its own signature of microbiota, the bacteria, fungi, viruses that live in a place. And so you swab the place that you hope it comes from, and then you swab the product when it gets to wherever it's going. And if it doesn't match up, then you've got a problem. So you would certify, in some situation you could imagine, you would certify aquaculture production operation as sustainable, as having, fair labor practices, however you want to measure it by. And then in order to ensure that the fish that says it's coming from that operation is in fact coming from that operation, you'd have that method. Other people are looking at blockchain. I did a story about illegal gems mining in Madagascar a couple of years ago for National Geographic, and so all these sapphires are coming out of the ground in Madagascar. They don't have the resources to enforce the park protections. They bribe the customs agency to smuggle the stuff out, and it ends up in some mall in Baltimore or whatever. And, people are paying $10,000 for something that some guy dug out of the ground and got paid $1 for. And bonus, you're destroying habitat for endangered species. Isn't that great?
There's potentially
so the idea here is that you would be able to use blockchain so that when the thing comes out of the ground, it gets logged as as coming from the sustainable place, and then the blockchain system marks it at each place on its path. So I could imagine that for fish as well. But that stuff gets expensive. So
yeah. Well, I'm noticing it is 12:30, so I want to thank all of the panelists here today. This has been Hakai Magazine's discussion of the Big Fish Aquaculture editorial package. I encourage you all, if you have a chance, to read or listen to the audio versions of all of these features on hakaimagazine.com. If you have questions and comments or further things that you'd like to get in touch with, you can go on social media. They're at Hakai Magazine on Twitter, on Facebook, etc. I'm sure, and the authors also have all of their individual handles, so we can continue the discussion, because I think that was one of the purposes of this panel and the package in general was to just further discussion of aquaculture in maybe a bit of a more nuanced way. Jude, do you have any final things that you'd like to say?
one of my takeaways, I think, from the package, reading everybody's articles, and Paul's piece, when it showed how bustling the economy was around these local fish farms, and how everybody was kind of involved, whether they're selling something to the fish farmer, they're buying, it's just a very robust economy. And I think if COVID showed us anything, it was the fragility of supply chains. So, and I think, we have a lot of local bivalve oyster leases and stuff we could buy from. We have Lois Lake Steelhead up in Powell River, a family-run business that's pretty big. But, I think this investment in medium and small scale and local production is a good idea from governments, NGOs, whoever.
Great. So we will end it there, but thank you for everyone for joining. And like I said, we can continue this discussion online, and please, send feedback and questions. Apologies we couldn't get to all of them today, but we really appreciate from you joining us from wherever you are in the world. And I guess we'll sit around and chit chat if people want to, but that ends the formal portion of this webinar. Is there anything else that anybody missed? They itching to say but didn't quite get to?
Hey, guys, thanks a lot. I got to run. It's late here.
Oh, right. You're in Amsterdam time. It's late. Thank you so much, Paul.
Yeah, it was a pleasure. I really learned a lot from you guys. I appreciate your contributions, and it was good to be with everyone. Thanks for pulling this together, Josh.
Thanks.
Thanks, Paul.
All right, be well.
Great meeting you.
Come visit.
When we can, safely.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Wear a mask.
Yeah, okay. I think we are going to end it here. But again, thank you to everyone for joining, and we'll see you later.